Sure, if you wouldn't mind coming on up. So Kevin is the general manager, one of these, there we go. Kevin is the general manager of Project 202 Dallas, spends much of his time with senior leaders at organizations. Incorporate experience in your company's DNA. So some of the key tenets are focus on the value of allowing teams to break tradition and support cross-functional collaboration. We've heard silos talked about a number of times. Ensure teams have training and change management skills to recognize that the experience is more than a department or mindset or an individual person. In all practice areas, whether product, finance, technology, or others, benefit from modern experience-driven thinking. So when you talk about experience and DNA, I think there's a couple things that we know, right? So we know communication is key, right? If you can get the business team, the user experience teams, the user empathy, you can get tech, you can get ops together, right? Like you're going to build a better product if all three of these are really firing all cylinders together. Full stack teams. We know full stack teams are important, multidisciplinary full stack teams. So you have designers and developers and QA and the product owner and everyone kind of embedded, obviously co-located if possible. That's not always possible, but they're forming a team. And then you need to train your organization in design, right? So the organization needs to understand the value of design, why you're going through some of these ceremonies, why you're going through some of these processes, why you're doing some of these activities. But you also need the people to execute design, which I've seen a lot of organizations kind of stop at the training and they don't actually fully move into making sure they have enough people to execute. In fact, a lot of modern thinking on the matter talks about how you should have one designer to every 5 to 9 developers, or basically one designer per every Scrum team. And then there's a big report out not that long ago called The Business of Value Design, and they did this huge kind of 5-year journey with these Fortune 500 companies, and they recorded financial data, but then they also recorded what they call design actions. And so or 100,000 design actions across these organizations across time. And a design action could have been something like they had a designer or design-led person sitting on the executive board. Management bonuses were tied to quality or customer satisfaction. And there were some smaller things as well, like iterating with users, journey maps, keeping top design talent, making design everyone's responsibility.
So Jeremy, sorry, just real quick, they're going to be breaking down this wall, so that's the noise.
Tell me what's behind the wall.
Yeah, exactly. So I saw fear.
You're not going to tell me? It's going to be, all right.
I saw fear on a couple people's faces.
I think Kevin is between us and drinks, so I'm going to hurry up.
Yeah, they're getting the drinks and food ready.
Okay. So. But the companies that scored higher, that had more of these, these design metrics, actually increased revenue and returns to shareholder, right? So if it was embedded in these organizations were following more of these design processes, there was a tangible effect on their business.
Just wait.
All right, Kevin.
Hey. I feel like we should do a duet as we transition into
As we transition? Yeah. We take requests. Is there a poll for what we should sing later, Toby?
First off, all of that is a lot easier said than done, and I'm sure you would agree with that. So hopefully we could share some insights to make it more tangible.
For Kevin, I know you spend a lot of time with senior leaders, and I know there was one client in particular. It was a recent, it was a large B2B services company, right? And that's kind of an interesting space anyways. And they were looking to improve their overall customer experience that they were providing to their customers. So it's B2B, other businesses.
Yep.
So I'm always curious. It's like what started this series of projects? Why were they looking to become more experience-driven? Why were they looking to improve their experience? Why now?
Yeah, and I don't know that I can say they necessarily were looking to be more experience-driven. Like a lot of companies, they had a problem that they needed to solve, and they recognized that if they solve that problem well, it could improve their customers' experience, right? It could have a positive impact on their customers. And they were, I would say exceptional in one way in that they recognized that if they followed the same process they had followed previously, even if they executed exceptionally well, they would have a really high likelihood of ending up with the same result. And so there was some maturity in understanding that they wanted to do things a little bit differently, and so that allowed us to have an experience-driven conversation around that. So what I can say is that as it relates to why we want to broaden that discussion, when we have that opportunity, and a lot of companies starting at that point where you've got a clear problem that's easy to articulate, it's a really natural place to start that customer experience journey. But when you think about being experience-driven and how broad that is, the opportunity is far greater than just solving for one problem, right? And that's what experience-driven is all about. And so I am happy to say that we do have a series of projects that we've done with them. In fact, I see what we're doing with that client as a bottoms-up transformation because these projects are building on one another, and the reach across that organization is getting broader and broader.
Is it the case where, and I saw one of the questions was kind of about stakeholder buy-in. So in this case, something needed to be done. I don't know if it was a new mobile app or a platform or something. Like, I guess, where did it start? And then how did it broaden into kind of this larger, full kind of customer experience engagement?
Yeah, so it did start with a solution that was targeting customers. So that makes it a lot easier when they recognize, particularly when they recognize you may be behind your competitors. Right. And so they understood that this was an opportunity when they're going to make an investment to leapfrog. And so there was a lot of motivation there to do something different, which would set the groundwork for us to be able to come in and help them understand that if you build a solution based on customer insight, that it's going to resonate with those users, and it is going to position you to deliver on experiences your competitors aren't.
So it's really, you want this thing to be successful, and for it to be successful, you have to understand customers, and the light bulbs went off, and there you go. That's one way to...
and I'm not sure everyone was on board, right? I think we had enough of the right people on board to get going in the right direction. But I would say now, we probably have, if we were to poll those customers, we probably have 95% of folks on board because they see the value.
Nice. So when talking about company DNA, you mentioned, breaking tradition, getting different parts of the business to work together that maybe hadn't worked together before. How do you go about that? Yeah,
it's interesting because when I think of tradition, in fact, Toby or Chris, if we could do this, let's do something live. Let's go off script a little here. What do you think of? What do you think of when you hear the word tradition? What comes to mind for you? Because we're talking about breaking traditions, and I had a reaction to that because when I think of tradition, I had certain images. Curious what yours were.
I have Thanksgiving.
So
That's
Chris,
what's in my head.
Pull that up. Thanksgiving, yeah. Fair enough.
You probably mean work traditions.
Toby's working on it.
Oh,
do you have one? Yeah, we'll take it.
The way things had always been. Yep. It's always been that way. Why would I do something different?
Agreed. Let's see is this a word cloud?
Yeah. No, it's just an idea. So like they'll just be able to.
Gotcha. Okay. Waterfall.
Oh, yes.
Traditional processes.
Yes.
Maybe outdated processes. They've got their place. Legacy. Yep. Yes, the need to honor the past. Yeah, that's very interesting. Historical. Yeah, so when I think about traditions, thank you for that, and Toby, thanks for letting me go off script. When I think about traditions, I think about a set of practices that meet needs, and usually over a long period of time, which means traditions are deeply rooted. And yet we also know that times change and needs change, and most of all, the needs of our customers change. And so when we think about breaking traditions and we think about delivering experiences almost in their own definition are very broad reaching. And so establishing cross-functional teams is one way of breaking a tradition because it forces you to kind of step outside of those silos. And so there's a lot of good momentum. By show of hands, how many people here believe in cross-functional teams? Okay, just about everybody, and I think that's in due part to a lot of momentum that we had with some of the earlier things you were referencing with Agile, right? There's a lot of momentum behind high-performing, empowered teams. But what I find is that we don't take it far enough. And in the spirit of time, I'll skip this, but I was curious. When you think about the functions that are actually represented in cross-functional teams, I can tell you when I'm talking with companies, typically three functions at most are represented in that cross-functional team. And so I think that we've started a good new tradition, right, of building those cross-functional teams, but we haven't taken it far enough. There need to be more functions represented. And so if you're looking at if you want to do a self-assessment, how well are we doing at building experience-driven principles into our company DNA, one of the things you can just look at is just take a look at your cross-functional teams. How cross-functional are they really, right? And so when we think about experiences we have to deliver, a lot of times we treat departments like legal or we treat departments like information security as a gate that we have to pass through, right? And the challenge is we know that those departments are built to manage risk for the organization. We know that they're there to protect assets that have been established. And when we treat them as a gate we pass through, we really take them out of being able to create a win-win, and we're putting them in a position where they have to constrain what the experience. And so I know this much. If they were engaged early in the process as a part of the team, they may be able to come up with a win-win. If they're not engaged at all, I know for a fact they're very unlikely to be able to come up with a win-win. So I think that's another way that you can look at in terms of breaking down traditions and how well you're doing at cross-functional teams is to take a broad look at those areas that are traditionally not isolated.
Yeah. I know when I worked at Travelocity, I remember I had a boss at the time, and so how you do lead pricing on travel websites is actually somewhat complex, and there's actually a legal component to that. And she camped out in front of the legal team's office, got to know the legal team, brought them into the story, brought them into the product team, and then they were much more agreeable to things that we were trying to do once we got to know them, right? Like once you shake someone's hand, once you have lunch with them, whatnot, right, and have that conversation, and they feel like that they're part of that team, right? And that was a big change for us.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, well, I think, do we have a poll, Chris? I think there's one. Who controls the polls? Toby does. All right, so how well do you feel experience-driven thinking has moved through your kind of entire organization? So again, this overarching principle, if it needs to be kind of embedded into your DNA, how many people think they're there? Or not there, whatever the case may be. So if everyone from behind the times could just invite one person to these meetups, just one person. Together, we could talk them into. Okay, and again, remember the chart I had before, the big survey from Envision. Like a lot of companies are struggling. Like it's hard to move up that maturity model. So it's you're not alone out there. Okay, so how do you go about with? Let's talk about the change management for a minute. So we're talking about large kind of customer experience changes, kind of large organizational changes, different ways of doing things, breaking tradition. Like, how do you do that?
Yeah, so first off, there are entire methodologies around how you affect change in an organization. But I can tell you from my experience, there's some core tenets that you can do. And I'll start with kind of the end, in that change is an ongoing activity. It's not something that you can kick a meeting off with. You can't just go through these tasks and knock these things out, and then change is going to happen effectively. You have to think about change as an ongoing process or a part of being experience-driven. But what I find helps is that you need to start with the why, right? And not to be glib, but if you're initiating change, there needs to be a reason behind it. And what I think happens sometimes with decision makers is we get these senior decision makers in a room and they decide something's important to do, and they've got a really strong why behind it, and they believe that because that why is so compelling, they don't necessarily need to share that broadly, and they don't necessarily need to evangelize it, because there's clear benefit to everybody impacted by it, so surely everyone would get on board. And I think that's a mistake. I think that once you identify that why, you really need to take that step to communicate it broadly about why you're doing the things you're doing. So that's step number one. As I think about, kind of the next part of that is it's assessing the impact of that change, which includes experiment-driven or experience-driven thinking, is to assess, well, what is this going to mean for people? How is this going to change things for people? And really being empathetic about it and understanding those positive and negative impacts. And why do we want to be specific about that? Well, if you identify those negative impacts, then you can have a very specific plan to mitigate those negative impacts. And when you're making communications, you can proactively acknowledge those areas that may be negative, and then you can also respond with the plan that you intend to address with it. And when you identify the very positive benefits that people are going to get from that change, again, from an empathetic perspective, it lets you lean in on those positives, right? And so it's kind of two sides of the same coin. But if you skip that step and you're overly optimistic and you're not taking that frame from the individuals that are impacted by that change, so you're going to miss that. And then I'll go into my third. Is that okay?
Yeah,
Any questions?
No.
No? Okay, great. Yeah, sorry. I'm on a roll. Yeah, I'll break into song here in a second.
Remember, you're between us and drinks.
That's
but
right.
Continue.
Yeah. So, so the last thing to consider there is engagement. And I think we all agree that when, if we think about it as human behavior, we don't like change, right? We like to recognize patterns. We like to know where our food is. We like to know where we're going to lay our head at night, those kinds of things. And we're geared to avoid change. But when we're engaged in the change and we understand what that change is about and what it means for us, we feel like a participant. And I think that is really, really important. Again, going back to where I started off, these are the things that need to be done continuously and throughout any kind of major effort. And I think that if you can get really good engagement, you're going to build ambassadors for change. You're going to build champions for change. And I'm not just talking about executives with budgets that can make things happen or decision-making authority, but I'm talking about the individuals that are a part of that and building that groundswell. And the opposite's true. If you don't bring along good participants as a part of this change, then you're going to have detractors, or worse, you'll have saboteurs, which can be really troublesome for your efforts.
Okay.
Yeah, just before we wrap up, there are a few questions that's been upvoted. It doesn't necessarily fall within your principle, but just thought that we could quickly hit it. I would feel.
I could hit executive sponsorship because that one was actually there.
Yeah, and while he's answering that, I also created it to where, since we have a lot of collective brain power in the room, that we can also put it up, and if anyone has their own idea, that they could type in of things that they've done, successfully in the past to gain executive sponsorship. As you're answering that question, I thought that
So executive sponsorship?
Great, yeah. So the good news is 100% of senior leaders I've talked to desire experience-driven thinking and principles and the value that comes from it. They haven't quite articulated it in that way, right? They use a different vernacular like time to market and top-line revenue and cost savings and EBITDA and my bonus and how I'm going to get my bonus, right? Which is, again, from an empathetic perspective, we all want that. We can all relate to that. But what I find is if we're able to frame these principles and the value that we get from these principles in the language of those executives, of those decision makers, that it helps us create alignment, right? And we should be able to, as all practitioners of being experience-driven, we should be able to draw a direct line from the company's objectives, these executives' objectives, all the way through to blackmail is also good. If you've got it, use it, all the way through to the value that individual wants.
So speaking the language of business is always a key one, and this presentation didn't go, your phone's on it. This presentation didn't go over too in depth around the ROI of design besides that one study, but there is one, right? And they do want their businesses to be successful. They don't want to be disrupted. They want to be here for another 50 years, right? And like design and experience can get you there.
And I definitely agree with the small wins, because we're really talking about building momentum, right? And different executives are at different points in their understanding and the value and the risks they're willing to take. And so if you can do those small wins and build momentum, that can be helpful.
So let's say it's a company that maybe is not very mature on that kind of experience maturity curve. Would you suggest training, or would you suggest like kind of just picking a project and like just running the right mechanisms for that project?
Yeah, if we're thinking about it on a spectrum between training and doing, I'm going to be oriented more towards doing, but I think they all have their place, right? Because first you have to create awareness of new roles and new duties and new responsibilities and what that means for you, but then the best way you're going to learn is by doing.
Yeah. Which would be the small win, potentially.
Yeah, another one that has had quite a few votes. What are some of the ways to build bridges or common ground across silos? And we'll do one more after this and then let people drink and eat.
Yeah, I feel like Grant touched on this a bit. I think it goes back to, if you think about, okay, how do you get started with experience-driven and how do you apply that in your organization? I think I thought I saw a question about, can you org chart your way into this? And while I do believe that one individual, okay, this is my sign, one individual can have a tremendous impact. Let me take yours. Whether it is, yeah, sorry, sure. Whether it is one individual or a team of individuals, I think of that as more of the capability, right? And that's important, but when you're trying to affect broad change and get experience-driven principles in your company DNA, you also need the culture and the belief system behind it as well. And so I think both of those ingredients are really necessary to affect that kind of change. As it relates to organizational objectives versus departmental objectives, if organizational objectives are done right and you tie into that belief system, it should create a lot of alignment across those silos.
Awesome.
Yeah. You just Kanye'd my mic. So actually, the second one, the prototype one, I actually have a strong opinion about. So I feel like it should be a matter of how long it's going to take you to build the thing that you're building, right? So if you're going on a large transformation effort and it's going to take many months to a year at some large investment, you should really do more foundational research. If you're releasing a photo sharing app that you could launch in a month, showing prototypes at the beginning is fine. Like everything should be proportional. So you shouldn't do a large customer experience, discovery program if the thing is very, very small. So it's always, in my opinion, very kind of proportional to the amount that you're thinking about investing in that particular product, and maybe even how important that product is to your business. If this is the core reason your business exists, and it's, then you probably want to do more research than less research. So anyways. All right, you want to be done? Yep. All right.
All right, thank you.
Thank you all very much.
So if you don't mind, help me thank Jeremy Johnson one more time for being such a great presenter. Like I said, since y'all are the guinea pig, I do have one more question for you on a poll. What did you think about using this as far as
This is to get our discount for the
engagement?
enterprise.
5 is great. Yes. Come on, I don't mind if one person is really negative and just throws it up there. All right, so it seems like it was fairly easy to use, a neat way to interact.
Everyone's always nicer in surveys, Toby. We know that. That's why we don't use surveys.
Exactly.
often.
I need to do some contextual inquiries, sit beside you. I get it. So, again, feel free. We have the space for the next couple hours. Feel free to network. We have
Meet someone new.
yeah, drinks, food, all back. So I tried to send different ones individual messages who had submitted questions that we didn't get to. But if most of them were submitted as anonymous, but if you let me know. If you come up to me, let me know that you asked that question and didn't get in.
Someone here could answer any question you have, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a good
So again, thank you so much for attending, and like I said, please feel free to stay and network with us. So thank you guys for coming out.